Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. Today I'm going to be returning to talking about matters surrounding the minimal facts argument for Jesus' resurrection. If you follow my work at all, you know that I'm very critical of the minimal facts argument. And I want to make something clear for the purposes of today's video. I'm not talking about the problems, the epistemological problems that I've noted before. Those epistemological problems concerning the argument are about how strong of an argument it would be even if a vast majority of scholars granted that the disciples had some kind of resurrection experiences or other. And so my criticism there has been that the some kind is insufficient to give you a strong argument for the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and even that some kinds of experiences that in theoretical possibility and even in the minds of some scholars they might have had would actually be evidence in a sense in a wider context against the bodily resurrection. But I'm not emphasizing that today. I'm also today not emphasizing a different layer of criticism, which is real concerns about Dr. Habermas's ability to interpret accurately the scholars that he summarizes and lists and tells you, what supposedly this scholar thinks. There are real serious problems with that, but today I'm not going to be emphasizing that. Today I'm going to be talking about a different layer, so there's a lot of layers of problems with this. I'm going to be talking about a different layer which concerns whether Dr. Habermas has actually documented the percentages that he has claimed. And even what he meant by these claims, where he's claimed that this, extremely high percent of scholars grants this, did he actually even document that? Because we've been taking his word for it on a lot of this. And one problem with that is if he's bad at interpreting, but another problem is that now he has said he didn't even do a head count. So today's today's video is going to be about some relatively recent, very strange remarks that Dr. Habermas has made that have come as a real surprise to me. This was about 11 months ago, but my attention was drawn to it only a few weeks ago. And my eyes were just popping because it goes contrary to many things that Dr. Habermas has claimed before. Now, I did a post on Facebook about that. I did a blog post about it, but I also promised I would discuss it on this channel. So here we go. About 11 months ago, Gary Habermas did a live stream where they were taking questions with Dr. Michael Lacona. And the question was raised, is the group appearance, at least one group appearance, a minimal fact? Now, that's a very interesting question, and I'm going to be pursuing it in other videos, not just today. In other words, what do the majority of scholars actually think about a group appearance? In the context of that question, which came from a skeptic, Pelagia, and Dr. Lacona gave that question to Dr. Habermas, Dr. Habermas said some astonishing things. He said that he has never defined a percentage that defines what counts, what's high enough percentage of scholarly agreement to count as minimal fact. And he said that he never did a head count of scholars to support any such percentage except for the empty tomb, and then he emphasized that the empty tomb isn't a minimal fact anyway. But that was the only one where he did a head count. So this was astonishing, and it came up a couple times in the video. want to start today by talking about what we know. What we know, what we can show, what we can point to and say, no, you actually did say this here, and yet this is what you say over here, and so forth. All right. Habermas definitely has defined vast majority of scholars, or virtually all, or those kinds of terms, as 90-something%. And to be a minimal fact, one of the criteria is that it's supposed to be supported by 90-something%. Now, in recent years, he's really tried to emphasize that's not the most important criterion. That's not what makes it a fact. Yeah, we get that, but it is a criterion. He's not going to call something a minimal fact unless it's supported by 90-something%. And even for like the next level down of, I forget what he sometimes calls it, second order facts or something like that, supporting additional facts of like a few more, they're also supposed to at least have a majority and a strong majority of scholarly agreement. And the empty tomb is one of those. So again, these are being defined in percentile terms. So just to demonstrate, he definitely has defined vast majority as 90-something%. Now, I'm going to give a quote here. This is from volume 1 of his magnum opus, which had just come out when, in the same year when he did this very surprising live stream. So this isn't even from long ago. Here we go. An oft-asked question relates to my repeated references that the vast majority of scholars, or virtually all of these experts, agree with this or that conclusion. Can these phrases be identified in more precise terms? In some contexts, I have already been more specific. At least when referencing the shorter list of minimal historical facts, I most frequently think in terms of a 90-something% head count. Of course, this only applies to those scholars who publish their views and accept the historical fact or a close approximation of it. This is from page 94, volume 1, on the resurrection in the Kindle edition. All right. Similarly, I'm going to be quoting several times here from a review of Dr. Lacona's resurrection book, which Dr. Habermas wrote, kind of a detailed review, in 2012. And you can find this online. Regarding my references, this is Habermas speaking, to the vast majority of virtually all scholars who agree, is it possible to identify these phrases in more precise terms? In some contexts, I have identified these expressions more specifically. At least when referencing the most important historical occurrences, I frequently think in terms of a 90-something% head count. Okay, no doubt this is one of the reasons why the concept has gained some attention. Exactly the same phrase, 90-something% head count. All right, what else do we know? Well, we know that Habermas says in this live stream about 11 months ago that he never defined a percentile, except for the empty tomb, which is not a minimal fact. All right, so here's where he denies that. All right, Lacona asks, what qualifies as a vast majority? Habermas, good question. We've never put, and then he pauses, a lot of people say things. We get emails saying, oh, you guys say it's got to be over 90%. I don't think I've ever said that. I don't know if you've ever said that, speaking to Lacona. We don't put amounts on it, Habermas says. And then later, Habermas, I never defined it, and I did it on purpose because let's just put it this way. If I defined it, what's going to happen if I said 85? Someone's going to say, I found 3 of your people, and they were 84. I mean, I just think that discussion goes nowhere. So what he's saying here is that he believes he never defined a percentile, because if he defined a percentile and someone went out and found that some of the scholars maybe had changed their mind or that he, misinterpreted them or whatever, then it would be below that minimum percentile, and he just thinks that goes nowhere. So he says he never defined it in order to make it less falsifiable. But as we've seen, he did define it. All right. And then he's also talking about his friend Bob Stewart. And Habermas, same video. Bob's a great friend, but he thought I said 90. I've not said anything in print. All right. So we've just demonstrated he did say stuff in print. And yet that, about 11 months ago, he claimed that he never said anything in print, even though one of those in print places was in that very same year. All right. Something else that we know, Habermas has definitely very strongly implied in what he has written that these percentages were not mere guesses, but were based upon rigorous research. He has even used the word head count, you heard, I just read, even used the word head count, as in the last quote, and he's used words like counts and tallies in other quotes. All right, here we go. This is in volume 1. Okay, so again, this is in this very recent work. These very critical emphases should be kept in mind amid complaints that will no doubt arise from those who object to more conservative voices also being included in the counts. That's on page 130. So he's responding to the criticism, you shouldn't be including conservatives in your counts. The point I'm just making here is that word counts is there. He's talking about who is included and who isn't included in the counts. And then same page, it is no fault of scholarship if, even after counting many of their major writings in the tallies, the research still did not favor either the mythicists or their theories. So again, he's responding to an accusation from mythicists that he's including too many conservatives and whatnot. But again, we got counting in the tallies. All right. And volume 1 also has this. The research notes themselves are anticipated to be published in volume 3 of this work as they chart the views of major critical scholars, reaching close to 1,500 manuscript pages and covering 140 separate categories or questions regarding the last days of Jesus' life. So again, he's implying that these research notes are gonna show this to have been rigorous. Going back to 2012, but are figures like these? This is after he says the 90-something percentile head count. But are figures like these based on something between a rough guess and an estimate? Academics quite often report things such as most scholars hold that, or the majority view here is that. Although similar phrases are found frequently in the literature, we may wonder how the knowledge of such conclusions were or even could be established. To answer this question, in my case, this is Habermas, what began as a rather modest attempt to update my resurrection bibliography grew by large increments until it developed into a full-blown attempt to catalog an overview of recent scholarship. The study dominated 5 straight years of my research time, as well as long intermittent stretches after that. So he's putting forward his work on this annotated bibliography to answer the question, how could you establish this? And implying that it was not something between a rough guess and an estimate. All right, what else do we know? We know that Michael Lacona definitely thought that Habermas did what Lacona calls serious bean counting. That's an exact quote from Lacona. So this is a quote from Lacona's Resurrection book, about 2010, published. A point of interest related to Habermas's research is that he is actually engaged in serious bean counting. Statements pertaining to a so-called majority of scholars are common and are usually based on educated hunches. And then he goes on to give some examples where those contradict one another in other scholars in other contexts. So he's contrasting Habermas. Instead, he is engaged in serious bean counting. So this notion that Habermas has set these percentage minimums for his facts and that he's engaged in careful counting, at least as far as, his own lights are concerned. Now, I think he's often misinterpreting, but at least by his own lights, he's engaged in careful counting and keeping tally and so forth. That's not just an impression that people got who were hoping to criticize Habermas or storing it up to play gotcha. This was what his own earlier co-author, his own previous protege, his very close friend, Dr. Lacona, who wrote a book on the resurrection which Dr. Habermas strongly endorsed, believed. Okay? And I want to give some credit here. I'm often very critical of Dr. Lacona, but in this live stream 11 months ago, he's obviously very taken aback, and he pushes on Habermas a bit. In fact, right in the live stream, he says, "But you've done all these counts over the years." Okay? So the strong impression that people got, including Lacona, seems to be something like this. You've got N total scholars whose works you're reading, and then you've got a list of facts, or propositions, we can say, and you're doing yes, no on whether these scholars affirm those facts based on your reading of their articles, their work. It's a literature survey, so that's where partly a problem comes in. But anyway, and you've got M who affirm, whom you're designating as affirming this fact. All right, so M out of N are affirming this fact. And then, because there are references to including skeptics and so forth, talk about that in a minute, there's a unified set of categories for scholars, skeptic, evangelical, liberal, but identifies as a Christian, something like that, all right? And so you're then within your total number of scholars, you've got a subgroup, okay, which is, let's say Y scholars who fall into a particular category, like the letter Y. This number of scholars being designated as skeptics, and X number of scholars within that category who are being designated as affirming this fact. So you have X out of Y skeptics or whatever who affirm this fact. All right, so again, we know that Dr. Lacona, as well as many, many other people, thought that Habermas was doing these rigorous counts and that lay behind his statements. And we also know that he definitely stated 90-something percentile for minimal facts. All right. But we also know that he definitely now says that he never did such bean counting except for the empty tomb. After Dr. Lacona says in the live stream, but you've done all these counts over the years, Habermas replies, just one, on the empty tomb. It's the only one I can remember doing a count. And then later, referring to the empty tomb, he says, now that I counted. All right, so not only is he saying that he didn't give a percentile except for the empty tomb, he's also saying that he didn't do a head count except for the empty tomb. All right, so here's something else that we can state definitely. Habermas has definitely said in print that the reason that the empty tomb isn't a minimal fact is because it doesn't meet the higher scholarly consensus requirement. So he has to have had a higher percentage in mind for things to be minimal facts, or else he couldn't say that the empty tomb doesn't meet it, right? That's the given reason. And he has strongly implied that he did the research necessary to separate those. Okay, the very top level from the next level down that gets a strong majority or something like that, but doesn't reach that higher minimum. So here, again, volume 1. So this is right in a recent publication. Less stringency is sometimes what has separated the two lists, especially in being less severe in achieving such high percentages of scholarly agreement than the near unanimous requirements for the events in the shorter list. I think that sentence could use a little editing, but it's clear enough, okay, that he separated them based on they're not, okay, this is a majority and it's a good majority, but it's not as high. I want to point out, too, if you just throw hundreds of marbles out on a table and you're making a sort of gestalt guess. Wow, a large majority of them are blue or something like that. I mean, you can do that, and that's even got a certain amount of reliability, but you're not going to be able to say with justified confidence that there are definitely 90% that are blue as opposed to 80%. Okay, I mean, if you've got hundreds of marbles, they're spread out here, okay, 600 marbles, let's say. Are you going to be able to tell by looking at them, it's, this is at least 90% of them are blue. So it's above that, or, it meets that. It's not just 80%. That's a pretty close, those are pretty close percentages. So you're going to have to do more marble counting or bean counting to do that. And he claimed to be distinguishing the two classes based on that. All right, here's something else we know. In 2021, Dr. Lacona stated in a video that he believes that Habermas told him that between 75% and 85% of critical scholars grant that at least one appearance experience occurred in a group setting. So that would place at least one, appearance, one group appearance experience, whatever that may be, in that second level, but still a strong majority. But remember, Habermas said the only one that he did a head count for was the empty tomb, not group appearances. All right. So that recently, 2021, we know that Lacona was indicating he was dependent on Habermas. He was taking Habermas's word for it and was verbally citing him as giving a percentage for something other than the empty tomb, and something, by the way, I'll get to this in a minute, that is very important to their case. All right, here's that quote. Then you have some that are, just not quite. There's strong evidence for it, but you don't have quite nearly 100% granting them. And that would be things like the group appearances, that some of those experiences occurred within group settings. I think Gary told me somewhere between 75 and 85% of critical scholars grant that. Okay, all right. Now, I also want to point out that there is a difference between saying the following. A vast majority of all scholars grant this, and that includes a couple of skeptics, okay? So this, again, we're supposed to be talking about things across the scholarly spectrum and so forth, and saying a vast majority of all qualified scholars, critical scholars, they've sometimes tried to define that, including also a majority of that subgroup that are skeptics, affirms this. And that's a lot more impressive, and I think this is a very strong impression that people have gotten. And let me give some quotes from Habermas and Lacona's joint work written in 2004. And by the way, in this recent live stream, Habermas sort of condescended to Lacona and said, I think you said that. I think, implying that was in some section that Lacona wrote of their earlier book. And I think that's very unfair to Lacona, because it's clear that Lacona was counting on Habermas for statements about majorities and so forth, and how many assert this, not the other way around. So to blame that on Lacona is wrong. All right. So page 75 of their jointly written book on the resurrection, we have presented evidence for Jesus' resurrection using a minimal facts approach, which considers only those data that are so strongly attested historically that even the majority of non-believing scholars accept them as facts. So that's the stronger claim. All right, here it doesn't say vast majority, but at least a majority of non-believing scholars. And by the way, elsewhere they use like skeptical non-believers or something like that. And they'll use, including skeptics, including skeptical ones. So non-believer here appears to mean skeptic. All right, here's another quote from page 149 of that jointly written book. The minimal facts approach considers only those historical data that are so strongly attested that virtually all scholars who study the subject grant them as facts, even the majority of non-believing scholars. So again, that's not just, the vast majority, including a couple of non-believing scholars, but the vast majority of all scholars, including a majority of non-believing scholars. All right? And then this is a little less clear, but can be interpreted in the light of the other quotes from page 46. Thus, our minimal facts include what nearly all scholars hold, including skeptical ones. So there's your word, skeptical. Seldom can we speak about what all agree on, for seldom do they all agree. All right. We also know that Dr. Lacona included at least one group appearance as historical bedrock in his own book. And just as with minimal facts, historical bedrock, his phrase, requires at least a very strong majority of all scholars affirming it. All right, so this is Lacona. We may likewise affirm that there was at least one occasion when a group of Jesus followers, including the 12, had such an experience. Treats that as historical bedrock. We also know that in their joint book in 2004, Habermas and Lacona made use of group appearances as a very important part of the article. In the interest of time, I'm going to summarize here. I'm not going to read all the quotes, but here's some summaries. On page 188, they suggest that the skeptic will need to postulate group hallucinations, and that these are very improbable, especially since they argue that the necessary preconditions, such as ecstasy, for group hallucinations were not present in these incidents. On page 142, they even go so far as to suggest that the skeptic would have to postulate multiple group hallucinations. Now, because of multiple group appearance stories. Now, Lacona appears to have drawn back from that, which of course you're allowed to do, in his own book, and as I just read a minute ago, on at least one occasion. My point is, though, that it does show the group appearances are playing an important role in the argument. And if you do the minimal facts case, I'm pretty sure you're going to be using the idea that Jesus appeared to at least one group. Or if we don't want to say Jesus appeared, but it seemed to at least one group that Jesus appeared to them. All right. So that's playing a role. And in fact, that's why the Skeptic Apologia asked that question, which Lacona passed on to Habermas about the group appearances. Like, why are you using the group appearances in your argument, even though group appearances are not a minimal fact? So Lacona then was like, well, are they a minimal fact? And that's how all this other stuff came up. Oh, I never made a percentage estimate, and I never did any head counting. All right. Now, we also know that volume 3 definitely disclaims being a place where the head counts will be shown. All right. Lastly, the lists of scholars in this volume are unrelated to the scholarly counts referenced in the first 2 volumes. They do not comprise any extrapolated figures from which the head count comments were made earlier. The task here was simply to provide an overview of hundreds of scholarly opinions across a multitude of topics, including over 7,000 footnotes. As noted previously, this volume was originally longer, but much of it had to be condensed. So what we're being told is this isn't going to give you the evidence for the head counts that were mentioned in the other volumes. In fact, it looks like we're never going to get that evidence. And I'm going to be talking more about that in a minute. It's a very disappointing comment to those who were looking forward to volume 3 with the expectation that, here we're finally going to get all that data that's going to show us how he's deriving these head counts. So where does this bring us? Well, we can definitely say that Habermas is wrong about what he wrote, because what he wrote is out there and can be read. So we can definitely say, when he says, I never made a percentage claim, well, that's not true, because we can go read what he said. Why did he say it? Well, that's more difficult to say, definitely. Why did he go on that live stream and say, I never made a percentage claim, when he obviously did? It can be so easily refuted. Now, it's been suggested to me when I posted about this on Facebook, that it would be charitable for me to believe that he was confused or mistaken. Well, that's possible. All right, it's possible that even though it had just been published in the volume that just came out, sometime between sending that to the publisher, which takes place a while before the book comes out, and this live stream, Habermas just forgot these multiple places where he'd said, 90-some percentile, had forgotten that had been a hallmark of his entire career. But I want to say something here. If so, that is no small degree of confusion. Now, I say this in all seriousness. I do not say this to be cruel or mean or snarky, but if you're going to say, well, I'm going to defend Dr. Habermas by saying he was just confused, he just forgot that he had given a percentile head count. Well, he doesn't sound like that. He's very emphatic, very definite, but if he's that confused about what he wrote so clearly on more than one occasion, even in a recently published book, on a topic that's that central to his work, somebody needs to stage an intervention. Now, again, I'm not saying this in snark. I'm saying this in seriousness. That would be a very serious degree of mental confusion. And, I worry sometimes people who try in a sort of reflexive fashion to defend a scholar, they want to have it both ways. And so the way to have it both ways would be, oh, this is a really sharp, active scholar out there giving lectures, and wow, so wonderful to hear Dr. Habermas give the minimal facts case for the resurrection, and then, oh, well, he's getting older, he's just confused about whether he made this claim about percentile head counts. Those two you can't have both of. But here, we don't know why he said it. Maybe there was some mental confusion, but if so, that's very serious mental confusion. But I want to move on to something else. We can say that he's wrong about whether he claimed a percentile head count, because that's published, that's out there. When it comes to his saying that he didn't do a head count, even by his own lights, even using his own interpretations, we can't say that he's wrong there, because we don't have any such head counts, right? I mean, Lacona bursts out in the live stream, but you've done all these counts over the years, and Habermas says, no, only on the empty tomb. All right, but we don't have any other counts, and volume 3 seems to indicate that we're not going to get them. All right, volume 3 is a list of, this scholar said this scholar said this scholar said this, and there are issues with some of the interpretations, but it never claims to be laying out, M out of N of all scholars and X out of Y of all skeptical scholars acknowledge this proposition. So could he be right? I think he could be right in what he said in that live stream 11 months ago. Maybe he didn't actually make rigorous head counts, although what he said did strongly imply that. What is some other evidence we have that maybe he didn't make rigorous head counts? Well, besides the statement in the live stream, there is the statement in volume 3. I'm not gonna, what I'm giving you here isn't the evidence of the head counts. This isn't the head counts. If he really had notes that record these head counts, those would have been very interesting to publish, or even a chart with all of all the scholars listed and how they're categorized as far as their place on the scholarly spectrum, and what position they take, yes, no on this fact and this fact and this fact, and what publication that conclusion is based on, and then you could just do the math from there. It's not there. Now, I have a suggestion about what I think might have happened. I'm not going to claim this is something we can know. This is a suggestion, but I'm trying to explain this data. I think perhaps Dr. Habermas substituted in his own mind reading and summarizing a very large number of articles and then getting a strong impression from all of that work of reading and, by his own lights, accurately summarizing those articles. He substituted that in his own mind for making a head count in the sense of, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, count them up, all right, and continuing to do so. Now, to be clear, given what I have recently discovered about major problems with his interpretations, even if I did have such a chart, I'm not just going to accept that, especially on items of special interest, without chasing down the publications and drawing my own conclusions, because I found so many problems with his interpretations. But we don't even have that, and I'm thinking maybe he's now correct to say that he didn't do some kind of comprehensive head count. If that happened, I think it would explain the evidence that he made notes on a huge ton of articles. In one place, he says 3,400 articles. And he came in his own mind to think that his impression, based on reading and making notes in so many articles, was tantamount to a head count, because it wasn't just a guess based on sort of incidentally encountering articles. Rather, it was a guess, it was still a guess, but based upon going out and intentionally reading a huge number of articles. And I think there is evidence to support this. Listen to the flow of what he writes in 2012. So this is going to be rereading part of what I read before and kind of going on. So the question he's answering is this based on something between a rough guess and an estimate? To answer this question, in my case, what began as a rather modest attempt to update my resurrection bibliography grew by large increments until it developed into a full-blown attempt to catalog an overview of recent scholarship. The study dominated 5 straight years of my research time, as well as long intermittent stretches after that. Apparently, I was not very successful at drawing boundaries. I pursued an ongoing study that classified at least the major publications on these topics, continuing on through other representative sources. I counted a very wide spectrum of scholarly views, tracing the responses to about 140 sub-issues or questions related to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. My bibliography is presently at about 3,400 sources and counting, published originally in French, German, or English. Initially, I read and cataloged the majority of these publications, charting the representative authors' positions, topics, and so on, concentrating on both well-known and obscure writers alike across the entire skeptical to liberal to conservative spectrum. As the number of sources grew, I moved more broadly into this research, trying to keep up with the current state of resurrection research. So I think maybe he's been thinking that it's not just an educated guess, because it's based on an impression that he got from what started as maybe an attempt to make a, continual rigorous count, but, then eventually didn't continue with that. And yet, nonetheless, I've been reading these, I've been footnoting these. It's over 3,400 articles, blah, blah, blah. And interestingly, in a very recent live stream, this was just recorded between Habermas and Lacona a couple weeks ago, the emphasis is there are over 8,000 footnotes in Volume 3. And he talks about his editor and assistant, Ben Shaw. Ben Shaw tells me that there are over 8,000 footnotes in that volume. Well, over 8,000 footnotes isn't a head count, okay? So again, this sort of flow of his research and his description of the flow of his research, I think confirms my suggestion that he never did a fully comprehensive, rigorous head count, even by his own lights, but that he did a whole lot of reading and annotating and therefore thought that he wasn't just making a guess, and that justified using words like counts and tallies. Another interesting piece of evidence in the live stream. 11 months ago, Lacona, in that live stream, challenges him to name even one non-believing scholar who affirms the group appearances. And Lacona even gives a little definition that these appearances were so similar that they thought they saw the same thing. When I record more things on what scholars do and don't grant, I'll be talking more about that. It's interesting that Lacona specifies that, apparently involving a visual component and some degree of intersubjectivity, even if it's only, I thought I saw him over there in that corner. I thought I saw him in the same corner, or whatever. Some kind of ability to compare notes about a visual, at least visual experience, and see that they were very similar. And Habermas has trouble doing it. He has trouble naming even one skeptical scholar who grants this. He names E.P. Sanders, and Lacona, I think, rightly challenges that. I don't think E.P. Sanders would be considered just an outright skeptic. Now, I don't consider him, a Christian in the theological sense, but he would be considered, somewhere sort of in the middle part of the spectrum. Interestingly, in that quote I just gave you, skeptical to liberal to conservative spectrum, right? Okay, so skeptical is over here. It's on the left side of the spectrum. I think Sanders would fall into the middle part of that spectrum, liberal, but not per se a skeptic. He calls him something weird, like a secular liberal Christian or some strange phrase like that. Okay, but Sanders is not considered to be way over on the left of the spectrum, even though from an evangelical perspective, he would be considered a liberal scholar. All right, and I think that's why Lacona, All right, Habermas names Dale Allison. Now, I've argued that creedally and theologically, Dale Allison's not a Christian because he denies and even sort of scoffs at the strong bodily resurrection of Jesus. Are you saying he had internal organs? Are you saying he had genital organs? Blah, blah, blah. But he would not consider himself a skeptic. Even on the resurrection, Dale Allison is a sort of objective vision guy. Not a very impressive objective vision, I believe, that he thinks they had, at least as a group, but some kind of objective, Jesus appeared to them in some way, though it wasn't at all like what we have in the Gospels. All right, and Lacona rightly is like, no, Now, Lacona calls Allison a fellow believer and asks him to tell us about his prayer practices, and, I don't agree with doing that, but he is right to note that Allison would not be what they would probably have thought of as a skeptic, an actual skeptic, when they wrote, for example, their joint book. All right. Habermas mentions Pinchas Lapide, but Pinchas Lapide, he isn't a Christian. He's still a Jew, still considers himself a Jew, but he believes Jesus rose from the dead. So to call him a skeptic would be very misleading. Finally, he pulls up Gerd Ludemann, and I'll be talking later a little more about what, in a later video about what Gerd Ludemann says and doesn't say, but it's literally the only unambiguous skeptic, all right, that he can come up with affirming group experiences. And he even says this strange thing, well, I can't vouch for what's in someone's heart, so whether to call that person a believer and an unbeliever. But of course, Lacona is just asking, based on Habermas's and Habermas's earlier statements, that these surveys include skeptics. The implication is that we're using some kind of publicly available concept of where the scholar belongs on the scholarly spectrum and whether he would be considered a skeptic on, that side of the scholarly spectrum. That side. All right. So it really looks like this claim is now falling apart, that he has some impressive percentage of even skeptics, like even a majority of skeptics who affirm this. And I think that his difficulty pulling up even a single unambiguous skeptic whom he would say affirms group appearances tends to confirm my suggestion that he's, over the years, substituted the fact that he read all of these documents for actually making and having a rigorous countable head count. Now, this is especially an issue for the group appearances, but for a further discussion of what I think the vast majority of skeptical and even liberal scholars probably don't grant about group appearances, we'll have to wait for another video or videos, this one already being one of the longer ones. If you're using the minimal facts argument, I'm going to advise you to rethink. As I've said, come over to the maximal data side. We have cookies. Even by its own lights, the documentation of these very high majorities affirming these facts, aside from the question of whether those facts would be enough to get you a strong argument, but whether there's that documentation, whether that documentation holds up to scrutiny, those are coming under very serious question. And these statements in this video 11 months ago, whatever Dr. Habermas's motivations may have been, are part of the reason why you need to rethink. Fortunately, there is a better way, and it's not circular argument, and it's not assuming inerrancy, and it's not any of that, but the maximal data approach also doesn't require you to talk for 2 hours on end to give all of the data. All of those objections I've dealt with elsewhere, but it is available to you, and this would be a good time to consider going to that and considering using that argument rather than relying on statements that Dr. Habermas has made in print about what a vast majority of scholars grant. Okay, come back next time to the Lydia McGrew channel. Thanks for watching.